Okay, so in this video we're going to bravely step into using Zbrush. Apologies to begin with because I have a cold at the moment, so I'm a bit sniffly. The first thing we need to do is we need to get this object out of here. So I've got the whole thing selected. I'm going to go to export selected. Natively you can export as obj format, but Zbrush will also take FBX, but not in the same way. I'll show you that in a minute. So in the object export there's a Zbrush preset, so you may as well just use that. Hit export, done, and then we head over to Zbrush. Okay, so this is Zbrush. This palette here lets you load in kind of common thing, but we're going to ignore that. This isn't really a tutorial on specifically the basics of Zbrush. There's plenty of stuff out there. I can highly recommend the Michael Pavlovich tutorials. They're excellent and they're free. They're on his YouTube channel. However, I'll do a quick overview, and also the good caveat I'll give you is I'm by no means an expert in Zbrush. I have a love-hate relationship with it, in that I love what it can do, but I generally hate using it. So that may become apparent the more we do this. So Zbrush is this weird program that has this concept of a document that you work in, and then the bit that we're interested in, the 3D objects that we're going to sculpt, they are tools that exist in that, and it probably doesn't pay to think about it too deeply. But we probably want to, the first thing you want to do is probably increase this document size so that you get the full kind of a bigger window to work in. So if you go up to document, hit double, and then you're good to go. To bring an object in, we go to import and go and find it. In this case, that one. Hit open and it drops into here, and you can see it, and you can see here it's called a tool. So that's what Zbrush calls 3D objects we work with. The other way you can bring stuff in, if you're using, so if you are going to use an FBX and try and get it in and you're like, it's not going to let me do that, then you actually need to go up to Z plugins and you need to go to the FBX export importer and import. But the cool thing about that is it'll embed textures and things like that into it as well, which is cool. But we don't need to do that, so we're alright with this object format. So if we want to be able to do something to this, then if we have it selected and we left click and drag, we can drag it out into the space that we've got. As soon as you've done that, if you go up to this button here, edit, or hit T, then it will allow you to actually edit this and start doing work on it. If you don't, so if I switch that off and try and do anything this, it'll just, as you left click, it'll just keep drawing it. So what that's doing is it's basically drawing 3D objects into a kind of 2.5D canvas document. If you get here and kind of do this, you're like, well, what do I do now? Then the easiest thing to do is to just hit Control N to create a new document, draw it back out, and then hit the T key to edit, and then you're back to where you need to be, or hit that button. Okay, so some things that are useful to know in the viewport. Zbrush is really optimized to work with a pen, Wacom pen, and so it has the shortcuts are for moving around are a bit odd until you get used to them. However, you can move around just using this panel on the side. Probably as you're starting out this may be easier, but if you want to frame whatever object you're working on, you can hit this or hit the F key. To move, you just click this button and move it around. If you left click, if you're not selecting the object, if you left click outside of the object, you can orbit around that way. If you want to move using a shortcut, if you hold the Alt key and left mouse button, it will work. And then if you want to zoom in and out, you you move as if you were doing this. So Alt, left click, and then let go of Alt, and then left, keeping your finger on the left mouse button, you can zoom in and out, which is dead weird. But you kind of get used to it working. But if you want to do that just using the button, you can use the Zoom 3D, and I imagine starting out this is probably going to be a bit easier for you. And rotate using that button, or you can use the left mouse button when you're not touching the object. The button below that is the Polygroups Display, which we've not got on at the moment. You can kind of see that. You can see the wireframe the object is brought in, but it will also show polygroups as well. And this other one, the only main one we're probably going to use here will be the solo, but we'll use that when we get into the subtools, which we're going to do in a minute. Above that is that symmetry, which you're not going to worry about too much now. You can basically push this thing into perspective or not, and this one, which is quite useful, is it displays a floor. So that helps knowing which way up and down is, because why would it be useful to know which is the front, back, top, left hand side? Obviously the makers of Zbrush, that's so important. If you want to constrain a view, then if you hold the shift key down as you're moving, it will snap to the nearest. And obviously in your perspective, this will give you a perspective view, but if you're out of perspective, you get a proper orthographic view. So that is actually quite useful. But you kind of got to know, you've got to be very aware of where your up and down is when you're doing that. If you do things, your undos are stored up here. So you can go back. I haven't actually done much stuff yet, but you can basically zip back through your undos and feed along all the way along to the top, which is useful to know. It comes through with this matte cap red material. If you click on here, you can change all of these to something that's easy to work on, which can be useful when you're trying to kind of get certain properties in the material, and certain matte caps offer more than others. Or you can edit the ones you've got. So, so like this matte cap red, you could go up to material and you go to modifiers, and you can change some of this stuff as well. So it'll update in the scene. So that's useful to know. Okay, so now I've got this object in here. If we go into this part here, the subtool, we can see that this whole thing is coming as one object. We actually want to split this out into a few different pieces so that we can work on each individual piece. So the way we can do that is we can go to split, split to parts, split into groups. It's whichever works for you. So we split it to parts, hit OK. Then what it's done is it's taken everything that's a separate part and it's dropped it into a subtool. So we can select all of these subtools, and you can see they're actually highlighted. If you hold Alt down and click, you can actually select the subtool yourself. This is where this button's useful. So if you go into solo mode, you click this, and what it does is it only shows the subtool you've got selected. So that's handy for working on one particular thing. You can do the same kind of thing. You can switch these on and off in here using the eye icon. But essentially that's what we're going to do, is going to work through each single one of these. So one of the issues we've got is resolution. So what I've got here is I've got a brush. So if I want to access the brushes, I hit B. There's a bunch of brushes here, and the brushes kind of work on a hierarchy for selection. So B selects brush, and then S will give you all the brushes that start with S. And I want to use a standard brush, so the standard brush is T. So if I come out of here and press BST, it will get me the standard brush. If I wanted trim dynamic, I would be brush, trim brush, dynamic, trim dynamic. So which is again strange, but you kind of get used to it. So brush, S, standard, T. There we go. And So if I try to sculpt onto this surface, which one I've got selected? This one. I basically have this brush, I have it set to dots. Let's move it to freehand so that I've got freehand. I can just along the top there are the options for the brush. We've got Z add, or it'll pull out from the surface. Z sub, it will push into the surface, and then the Z intensity is basically by how much. And obviously this is also controlled by the if you're using a pen, a Wacom pen, like how much it goes in and out, is controlled by the pressure sensitivity. Focal shift is, so if we look at this brush we've got now, the draw size you set to set the overall size of it, and then the focal shift is basically where you've got these two circles. It's basically the fall off. So if you want to have a really tight transition, then you lower the focal shift. And you can also control the size of the brush by just using the bracket keys, so that's the same as Photoshop, which is useful to know. Next to the Z add Z sub are the materials, RGB, material and RGB. We're not going to go anywhere near those because we're not going to do any texture in here, but that's basically for adding colour to things. Now if we've got that set up and we start to play with this, the problem we've got is basically we have no resolution. So we're trying to affect change by drawing onto this, or sculpting onto this model, and it can't really do a lot because there is nothing there to do. So what we need to do is we need to get a bit more resolution into it. Now the way we set this thing up, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can use, so we're going to our panel on the right hand side here. If we go to the geometry panel, we can divide the model up, and that's quite useful. But if we look at the distribution of the polys, what we're getting is we're getting basically more polys going into the corners because they're being subdivided more because there's more initial geometry there, which is not what we want. What we want to do is have a fairly even distribution of polygons. So the first thing we're going to do before we do anything else is we're going to use this thing called Dynamesh. Now Dynamesh, you basically give it a resolution to start with, which is basically just a number that tells it like the weight or the distribution of how many polys should go along a surface. I'm going to start with something like 500 or close to 500. Hit Dynamesh, and as you can see, what it does is it basically creates even geometry all over the object. So now if we go to paint into the surface, we get something which is a bit more useful. One of the things with the standard brush, which is a bit annoying, although it does have its uses, is that it seems that it defaults using a thing called lazy mouse. So if you see when I'm drawing there, I get this nice and small. You see when I start to draw into this surface, it actually has a little red line, and that red line is designed to kind of steady my stroke, which if I was trying to do big strokes like that would be really useful because I don't have a particularly steady hand. But for the case of if you're just sort of generally trying to do things that are fairly organic, it may not be that useful. So lazy mouse lives in there, so you can switch that off by basically clicking on that, and then as I draw onto this now, I basically is a bit more freeform. So now I've got a bit more resolution, I can paint into that surface. If I want to, if I go to paint and I hold the shift down, it basically defaults as a smooth brush, so that allows me to soften things out a bit more, which is really, really useful. And that's the same on most tools, it uses a smooth, so that's on shift. And if I hold Alt down, it does the opposite of whatever the default function is. So if in the case of standard it's a Z add, if I hold Alt down it becomes a Z sub, so it allows me to cut into the surface. So that's kind of useful to know. The last one of those is Control. is a mask. So if I want to mask something, so I don't want to paint on it to do anything to there, I can paint on there. If I want rid of the mask, I just need to keep Control down and just click outside of the shape and I'll get rid of it. But if I mask it and then do my Z, like my brushing around the outside or my sculpting around the outside, it won't affect that area. And I can go back in, and if I wanted, I can kind of smooth that area out. And if that was the sort of thing I was trying to make, you can soften it by holding Control down. That'll get you a softer transition anyway. So then when I a bit softer, right, if I click outside, I can do selections like this. So I wanted to select that area, then I could, if I hold Control down and click outside, I can get the I can get it to invert the selection, but then I could go back in and carve out interior if I wanted to, and then really easily. So mask quite useful as well. So the next thing will be what we're actually going to do with it, which is, if I get back to a state where I'm kind of close to go back a few of these steps. Okay, so I'm just going to run my Dynamesh. Resolution about 500. And you can combine those things, so I can Dynamesh that and then divide it and keep it past that point, so that it now starts to become something which is. And as you can see up here, it's telling me that the active points here are 107,506 polygons, which is a lot, but not by ZBrush standards, not loads. It can handle a lot of polys. So anyway, back to the job in hand. So the process we're going to go through here is basically we want to try and create a kind of stylized stonework for this object, and that's going to require us to do a few processes, but mainly it's just a case of carving away at the edges and kind of just getting it to have a kind of stone-like feel. So I'm going to start with this top piece, and I'm going to work my way down through each part. So let's start with that. So I'm just going to solo it out, frame it, zoom back out a bit. We can use quite a lot of resolution on something like this. The first brush I'm going to use is, in fact I'm going to go divide it one more time. I'm going to use the brush trim dynamic. So the brush trim dynamic is basically, it's a trim brush, which basically means it's a cutting brush. So I'm going to use that to just carve out the edges. So I'm going to be quite rough with it. I'm going to change the alpha to a square alpha. It's a square to cut with, and essentially I'm going to carve out the edges to make it look like a kind of, give it the feel of like a carved stone. Again, we're going for something that's stylized, so it's not going for necessarily something which is uber realistic. The important thing is that it's going to read reasonably well. Go with a slightly bigger brush. It's going to read reasonably well when normal map it, because essentially we're going to use Substance Painter to build the textures with and just get a bit of detail into it. So this is just a first pass, just to try and get a kind of sense of the shape of it. I'll just use the actual buttons, you can see them. Just literally going around the edges, just making it look like it's been really roughly cut. I'm going to change this matte cat to something a bit more useful. Okay. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to, later on down the line, is we're going to polish it and we're going to add some cuts to it. So I just want to double check that we've got the kind of resolution that's going to work for that. So because I may as well have it now, because when I add noise to it, I'm going to need that resolution anyway. So if I just go to my brushes, hit B, I actually want to load a brush in, because the brush I want to use is the Orb Crack brush, which I may already have installed, but I wanted to show you how to install one. So if you want to bring an external brush in, you can go to Load Brush, and then you go and find where you need it, where you're getting it from. Back here, cracks, OK, and that loads it into there. Now if I go back into brushes and I go to O, B, LMN, Orbs Crack brushes down there at the bottom. Then essentially I'll just test this out, whether there's enough resolution in this to add cracks later on down the line. Okay, not too bad, good, okay. So now that I know I can do that, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a just simple noise layer to this, just to give it a bit of tooth. So I can do this using surface. So under this panel, if I go into surface and go to noise, what it does is it creates this little window, and the same controls work. So Alt and left click to move, and Alt right click to orbit round, or if you let go of Alt it'll zoom up a bit. So I'm going to change the scale of the noise, get a bit more obvious, and then I'm going to use this curve to change the shape, and I can flatten it out a bit like that. Do it fairly flat in the sense that I think something like that, so it's kind of eroded away a bit, but it's still fairly flat. I think that's going to be fine. Okay, so I hit OK, and then it applies it to the object. For it to actually work, I need to hit Apply to Mesh, and then so if I just zoom in a bit, you can see that. So now what I'm going to do with this block is I'm just to kind of get it back to being a bit, because it's getting a bit too real looking. It's just to try and get some of that stylized read back into it. So I'm going to use a brush called the H polish brush. So that's B H, gets me H polish, and H polish is a polishing brush. Basically averages the area you're painting over the top of and tries to flatten it out and polish it. So it'll basically find these edges, these corners, and it will try and to them, which is great now that we've got a bit of tooth into this, because we can just start to kind of push this into the corners and re-flatten it out a bit, but we can still retain some of these little chips and dints, which will work really nicely when it comes to the normal mat. So then when I get to the edges, a bit smaller, I'm going to start finding some of these edges with a view to trying to get some sharper more stylized I'm just going to go back in with a brush trim dynamic, and just over these sharper edges I'm just going to carve out a rougher detail, just so the transitions are a bit softer. And then the last thing I'm going to do on that is just unsolo it for a minute so I can see what it looks like, frame it, so back in the larger context of these objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add some cuts to it, and I'm going to prop where this part intersects with it. So it seems to make the most sense. I'm going to hit BO for the old crack brush that we brought in. Hard stroke and then a soft stroke and then back into a hard again. Try to get a sense that I do that. Zoom back in it again. Work them up a bit, so brush TD. And kind of carve at them a bit. Pull the focal shift down a bit, so anyway, I'm going to go and do the same with the rest of it, and then with the rest of the object.